Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
A Certain Kind of Perfection marks the earliest work of Emma Lazarus. Consider a poem from her first, privately printed volume, published when she was a mere 17 years old. The lines are measured, the allusions drawn from a deep well of classical and European lore, the emotional tenor one of serene, elevated melancholy. Here is a poet demonstrating an almost startling command of the formal architecture of Victorian works. The work is a declaration, a carefully constructed portfolio submitted for admission into a highly exclusive club of the American literary establishment of the Gilded Age. The central intellectual challenge of her early life was precisely the submission. For a young woman of immense privilege and learning, born into an old and wealthy Sephardic Jewish family in New York City, the path to artistic legitimacy was a complex negotiation. The cultural high ground was held by the New England Brahmins, a formidable cohort of writers and thinkers, overwhelmingly male and rooted in a Protestant, specifically Unitarian, worldview. To be heard, one had to speak their language. Her chosen methodology was one of profound intellectual assimilation and competitive prowess. She would master their canons, command their forms, and engage their leading figures with a confidence that bordered on audacity. Her first two collections, poems and translations from Level 866 and Admetus, and other poems from Level 871, function as exhibits of this strategy. They are works of formidable technical polish. The verse moves with a graceful, assured rhythm, deploying sonnets, odes, and dramatic monologues with the skill that belies her youth. The subject matter is telling tales from Greek mythology, meditations on nature, and translations from European masters. Her translations of Heinrich Heine, in particular, were a crucial component of this approach. In rendering Heine's German into English, she was performing multiple functions. She was demonstrating her linguistic and scholarly credentials, aligning herself with a sophisticated, cosmopolitan European sensibility that was highly prized by American intellectuals. She was also absorbing Heine's unique fusion of romantic lyricism and biting irony, a sensibility that would subtly inform her own developing voice. Her father, Moses Lazarus, a wealthy sugar refiner, provided the essential support for this endeavor, financing her publications and fostering an environment where his daughter's intellectual ambitions were cultivated as seriously as those of any son. The most potent example of her strategy in action is the correspondence she initiated with Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1868. This was an act of immense ambition. Emerson was the sage of Concord, the philosophical center of American letters. For an unknown poet from New York to approach him directly was a bold move. Her initial letter is a masterpiece of rhetorical positioning. It blends genuine, youthful reverence with an unshakable, quiet confidence in her own gifts. She presents herself as a disciple seeking the master's judgment, yet the very act of sending him her self-published volume implied a belief that the work was worthy of his attention. She was asking for his blessing and simultaneously demonstrating that she possessed the talent to deserve it. Emerson's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He recognized the power and polish of her verse, praising its high poetic right. With this recognition, he became her most significant early influence, a mentor and a crucial gatekeeper. His validation granted her an intellectual legitimacy that money alone could never purchase. For several years, their correspondence flourished. He offered critiques, suggested readings, and welcomed her into his intellectual orbit. She, in turn, absorbed his transcendentalist philosophy with its emphasis on self-reliance, the divinity of nature, and the universal soul. Her poem Heroes, from the Admetus volume, is steeped in this Emersonian ethos, celebrating the quiet, unrecognized greatness in everyday life. This period represents the apex of her strategy of assimilation. She had gained the attention and respect of the most important literary figure in America. Her work was being published and reviewed favorably. She had successfully navigated the treacherous social and cultural currents to establish a foothold on the shores of American literature. The influence of this early success was felt primarily within the nascent literary circles of New York. For other aspiring female writers, Lazarus provided a powerful model of what was achievable. She demonstrated that a woman could engage with serious, classical themes and demand the respect of the male-dominated establishment. Her home became a salon, a gathering place for writers, artists, and thinkers, positioning her at the center of a growing cultural sphere distinct from Boston's. She had, in essence, built her own platform, using the materials and tools of the old guard to construct something new. The very forms she had mastered, the classical allusions, the metrical precision, were the instruments of her ascent. She had proven her parity on the established terms of engagement. This achievement, however, contained the seeds of a future intellectual crisis. The universalizing, optimistic worldview she had so effectively adopted from Emerson, a philosophy that tended to smooth over the rough, particular edges of history and identity, would eventually prove an inadequate vessel for the full range of her experience and insight. The very mastery of form that allowed her entry into the serene world of classical ideals and transcendentalist thought would soon become the vehicle for exploring far darker, more complex, and historically fraught territories. Having earned her place within the temple of American letters, she would begin to examine the stones of its foundation, questioning the serene optimism that held it all together. This hard-won mastery of classical form and language provided Lazarus the very instruments she would need to conduct a deeper, more perilous inquiry. The polished surfaces of her early verse reflected the serene light of Concord, yet beneath them, a profound intellectual dissonance was gathering force. The universal soul, as envisioned by her mentor Ralph Waldo Emerson, was a beautiful, abstract conception, a spiritual democracy where all particulars dissolved into a harmonious whole. For a young poet seeking entry into the American literary pantheon, this philosophy was a key. For a young Jewish woman acutely aware of a history defined by its fierce, often tragic, particularity, it was a proposition that grew increasingly untenable. The central intellectual problem of her middle career became the reconciliation of this abstract, optimistic universalism with the dense, weighty, and frequently sorrowful specificity of historical experience. Her solution was a turn inward and a turn backward, employing the high literary genres she commanded to excavating the darker strata of human psychology and history. Her 1874 novel, Allied, an episode of Goethe's life, represents a significant early step in this evolution. Drawing from Goethe's own autobiography, Lazarus constructs a fictionalized account of his youthful romance with Frieda Reich. The choice of subject is revealing. She moves toward the towering figure of German letters, a mind whose own work, particularly Force, grappled with complexities of ambition, temptation, and tragedy far beyond the scope of Emersonian idealism. In Lied, Lazarus explores the emotional cost of genius, depicting a Goethe whose artistic ambition leads him to a casual, almost thoughtless, betrayal of love. The novel is a study in psychological realism, a departure from romantic convention that focuses on the subtle wounds inflicted by great man's self-absorption. Here, the universal ideal of the great artist collides with the particular pain of a single human heart. She was already using fiction to probe the unsettling moral ambiguities that exist within celebrated lives, a theme that would acquire greater and greater force in her work. This exploration of moral darkness found its most potent expression 2 years later in her verse drama, The Spagnolto. Published in 1876, the play is a bleak, Jacobean tragedy set in 17th century Naples. Its protagonist is the real-life painter Giuseppe River, nicknamed the Little Spaniard, whom Lazarus reimagines as a tyrannical genius, pathologically jealous of his rivals and pathologically possessive of his daughter, Maria. The play is a claustrophobic world of artistic intrigue, poison, and incestuous obsession, culminating in a devastating climax of suicide and madness. In its formal structure, it owes a clear debt to Shakespearean tragedy, employing blank verse and 5-act structure to lend classical weight to its grim subject. The work stands as a stark counterpoint to the prevailing optimism of the genial tradition. It suggests that the creative impulse, the very engine of Emersonian self-reliance, can be intertwined with cruelty, paranoia, and destruction. The artist here is a monster, his studio a torture chamber. The play received some critical praise for its power, yet its unsparing vision of human depravity placed it far outside the mainstream of American letters. Lazarus was using the most elevated of literary forms to demonstrate that the human soul contained depths that philosophy preferred to ignore. Parallel to this creative work, she was honing a distinct intellectual voice through her critical essays for leading periodicals like The Century magazine. This prose became her laboratory for analyzing the complex interplay of identity, history, and art. Her writings on European figures reveal a mind wrestling with the burdens of the past. A particularly telling example is her fascination with the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. In him, Lazarus saw a figure who navigated the highest echelons of power while carrying the indelible mark of his Jewish ancestry. She examined how his public persona and his literary work were shaped by this dual inheritance, seeing in his career complex performance of identity on the world stage. Her engagement with George Eliot's Mundell's 1876 novel, Daniel Deronda, was even more formative. Lazarus reviewed the novel, which famously championed a form of Jewish nationalism, with deep and perceptive sympathy. She recognized in Eliot's work a powerful validation of Jewish history and a call for cultural renewal. For Lazarus, Eliot, an English novelist from outside the faith, had articulated a vision of Jewish purpose and peoplehood with a clarity that was electrifying. Analyzing Eliot's work gave Lazarus a new vocabulary and a conceptual framework for thinking about Jewish identity as a positive, creative force in the modern world, a historical inheritance with a future-oriented mission. Through these critical interventions, she was publicly constructing a sophisticated worldview, one that acknowledged the force of antisemitism and the deep roots of historical identity, moving her intellectual center of gravity away from New England's philosophical abstractions and toward Europe's dense historical realities. By the close of the decade, the intellectual architecture of her thought had been profoundly altered. The serene, universalizing optimism she had inherited from Emerson had been complicated and enriched by tragic vision drawn from Shakespeare, a psychological depth from Goethe, and a new consciousness of historical identity from her critical engagement with figures like Eliot and Disraeli. She had developed an aesthetic capable of holding immense sorrow and a philosophy that could account for the stubborn, irreducible facts of history. Her art had become a vessel for exploring the very problems that transcendentalism seemed to lie: the persistence of suffering, the burdens of the past, and the powerful claims of a particular people's story. She had forged the intellectual and artistic tools to confront the darkest aspects of the human condition. The remaining question was what would transpire when the darkness ceased to be a subject for historical drama and critical reflection, and instead appeared as a catastrophic, present-day reality demanding an immediate response. The intellectual tools she had so painstakingly forged were now conscripted for an immediate, desperate cause. The catastrophic present-day reality arrived in the spring of 1881 and intensified through 1882. From the Russian Empire, news of the pogroms of Wave of State condemned, mob-led massacres against Jewish communities reached American shores, carried first by dispatches and then by the traumatized survivors themselves. For Emma Lazarus, this was a moment of profound, irrevocable transformation. The abstract problem of historical suffering, which she had explored through the lens of Shakespearean tragedy and German philosophy, materialized in the flesh. It appeared on the docks of New York City and in the makeshift refugee shelters on Ward's Island, presenting a moral and artistic challenge that would redefine the entire purpose of her life and work. The crisis was twofold. First was the immediate humanitarian emergency. Thousands of destitute Russian Jews, fleeing violence and persecution, began arriving in a city unprepared for their reception. They were met with a mixture of sympathy, bewilderment, and a thinly veiled hostility from a society grappling with its own anxieties about immigration. The second crisis was an internal, artistic one for Lazarus herself. What is the function of poetry, of refined literary expression, in the face of such overwhelming, visceral human misery? The serene contemplation of Emersonian ideals, or the aesthetic appreciation of Goethe seemed an almost decadent luxury. Her entire artistic identity, built upon a foundation of high culture and intellectual detachment, faced an existential threat. Her solution was a complete synthesis of her personality. The artist and the citizen, the poet and the polemicist, would merge into a single, powerful instrument of advocacy. Her response began with direct, corporeal engagement. She made frequent, harrowing visits to the temporary barracks on Ward's Island, where the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HEAS, struggled to provide for the refugees. There, The theories of historical persecution she had read about became tangible. She saw the faces of people who had lost everything, heard their stories in language she was now fervently studying, and witnessed the profound dislocation of a people cast adrift. This experience, a direct, unfiltered encounter with the human consequences of anti-Semitic violence, provided the raw, emotional fuel for her subsequent work. It was here that George Eliot's novel, Daniel Deronda, which she had previously reviewed with a degree of critical distance, became less a literary artifact and more prophetic blueprint. The novel's advocacy for Jewish national renewal and self-determination resonated with a new, urgent clarity. The fictional Mordecai's call for a Jewish homeland ceased to be a romantic idea. It presented itself as a pragmatic necessity. This intellectual and emotional fusion produced her most politically significant prose work, a series of 15 impassioned essays published in the American Hebrew between November 1882 and February 1883, titled An Epistle to the Hebrews. The work stands as a foundational document of American proto-Zionism, a full 14 years before Theodore Herzl would publish his seminal pamphlet, Der Judenstaat. In the epistle, Lazarus presents a searing diagnosis of the Jewish condition and a radical prescription for its cure. She directly confronts the comfortable, assimilationist philosophy of America's established German Jewish elite, whom she felt were failing to meet the historical moment. She argued that emancipation and enlightenment in the West had created a dangerous complacency, a superficial, lukewarm, and vaguely sentimental Judaism that was ill-equipped to handle the ancient, resurgent hatred embodied by the pogroms. Her methodology in the epistle is that of a brilliant polemicist. She marshals historical evidence, sociological observation, and righteous indignation to build an irrefutable case. She argues for the establishment of a secular Jewish state in Palestine, a place for national consolidation and self-protection. She likewise advocates for a pragmatic program of technical and agricultural education for the refugees arriving in America, seeking to equip them with the skills for self-sufficiency and to counteract the stereotype of Jews as mere tradesmen or financiers. This was a direct challenge to the prevailing philanthropic model of simple charity. She was calling for structural change, for a fundamental rethinking of Jewish identity from one of a scattered religious minority to that of a unified, modern nation. Her work with He's and her advocacy for vocational schools were the practical applications of the very philosophy she was articulating, creating a powerful feedback loop between her writing and her activism. Her poetry underwent a parallel transformation, shedding its classical restraint for the roar, prophetic fire of the Hebrew Bible. The most potent example of this shift is the 1882 poem, The Crowing of the Red Cock. The title itself is an apocalyptic signal, a symbol of dawn breaking on a scene of carnage. The poem dispenses with lyrical grace for a rhythm of relentless, percussive terror. It catalogs the horrors of the pogroms with unflinching detail from the ghetto's plague-rid maze, see the blinking, bloodshot gaze. The poem's voice is one of pure, unadulterated rage, a Jeremiah-like cry against a world that stands by in silence. She invokes the long, bloody history of Jewish martyrdom, from the massacres of the Crusades and York to the slaughter in Blois, framing the Russian pogroms as the latest eruption of an ancient evil. The poem culminates in a vision of a new-fledged hope, a banner of the Jew, rising from the ashes. This hope is explicitly national, a political aspiration born from tragedy. The poem functioned as an emotional catalyst, designed to shock her readers out of their complacency and to give voice to the collective trauma of a people. Through works like this, Lazarus was inventing a new Jewish American poetics, one that could contain both the particularity of historical suffering and a universal demand for justice. Her art was now a weapon, honed by scholarship, and aimed, with political purpose, forever altering the landscape of American letters and the trajectory of Jewish thought. That this prophetic voice, forged in the crucible of the Russian pogroms, soon found its most enduring vessel. The occasion was a matter of civic fundraising, an enterprise seemingly far removed from the raw anguish of her recent work. In 183, the American Committee for the Statue of Liberty, helmed by William Maxwell Evarts, sought to raise funds for the construction of a pedestal upon which Frédéric August Bartholdi's monumental gift from France would stand. An art and literary auction was organized, and Emma Lazarus was invited to contribute a poem. Her initial reluctance speaks volumes. She felt little inspiration for a statue she had yet to see, a commission that felt perfunctory. It is the author Constance Carey Harrison who provided the crucial catalyst, urging her to consider what the statue would mean to the very refugee she was now working with so intimately on Ward's Island. This connection between the abstract, a symbol of Republican liberty, and the tangible suffering of the immigrant ignited her imagination. The result was a poem that would perform one of the most successful acts of cultural appropriation in history, seizing a monument of cold copper and transforming it into a living vessel of compassion. The work she produced, a Petrarchan sonnet titled The New Colossus, was a masterpiece of rhetorical engineering. Her choice of form was itself a statement. The sonnet, with its long tradition of high artistic seriousness and its strict internal logic, lent an immediate readers to her message. Its structure, an octave posing a proposition, followed by a sestet delivering a resolution, was a perfect framework for her intellectual maneuver. In 14 meticulously crafted lines, she would redefine the meaning of the monument and, by extension, the promise of America itself. She was using the established tools of classical European poetics to articulate a vision that explicitly repudiated old world values. The octave opens by establishing a powerful contrast, setting her statue against the legendary Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. She invokes the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. This image is one of masculine, military power, a monument to imperial might and territorial dominance. Her new Colossus stands in direct opposition. It is a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is imprisoned lightning. This is a modern, Promethean fire, a symbol of enlightenment and progress, held aloft. Her location is equally significant at our sea-washed sunset gates. This simple phrase reorients the globe. The sun sets in the west, and, from the perspective of the arriving European, America is the land of the sunset. The statue stands at the gateway to this new world, its back turned to the ancient lands of Europe. Then comes the poem's central, transformative act of naming. She calls the statue the mother of exiles. This 2-word epithet is a stroke of genius. It instantly erases the statue's identity as liberty enlightening the world, a somewhat abstract, Republican concept and replaces it with a deeply personal relational identity. She is a maternal figure, defined by her children, the exiles of the world. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Her power is a moral authority, her gaze one of compassion, a stark departure from the conquering stare of the ancient Colossus. With this new identity established in the octave, the sestet gives the statue its voice, turning a silent monument into a global orator. The poem pivots with the Italian turn, or asterisk, volt, or asterisk, as the mother of exiles herself speaks. Her first words are a declaration of purpose, a direct address to the old world's key, ancient lands, your storied pomp. This is a stunning renunciation. She dismisses the history, the glory, the entire hierarchical structure of European civilization as mere pomp. It is a declaration of cultural and moral independence. What follows is perhaps the most famous passage in American poetry, a direct call to the dispossessed of the earth. Give me your tired, your poor, / your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The language is simple, direct, and profoundly active. It is an imperative, a command of welcome. The statue is claiming these people as her own. Lazarus follows this with a line of shocking, almost brutal empathy. The wretched refuse of their teeming shore. She refuses to romanticize poverty or exile. She embraces the people whom the ancient lands have deemed refuse, the human debris of industrial and political turmoil. This unflinching realism gives the poem its immense moral power. She is claiming the unwanted, the discarded, the broken. The final two lines offer a closing image of unwavering welcome. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me, / I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The lamp is a beacon of guidance and safety, a light in the storm, and the golden door transforms the harbor from a simple port of entry into a portal of mythic significance, an entrance to a new life of promise and dignity. The poem was read at the 1883 exhibition and published in a portfolio, yet its immediate impact was muted. When the Statue of Liberty was finally dedicated in 1886, a year before Lazarus's death, her poem was absent from the proceedings. Its powerful message lay dormant, a seed planted in the cultural soil. Its eventual ascent into the American consciousness was the result of a posthumous campaign led by her friend and admirer, Georgina Schuyler. Troubled that Lazarus's defining words were being forgotten, Schuyler initiated a persistent effort that culminated in 1903 with the placement of a bronze plaque bearing the sonnet's text on an interior wall of the statue's pedestal. It was here, inside the monument itself, that the poem began its true work, slowly seeping into the public imagination until it became inseparable from the copper skin of the statue. It became the official script, the voice that millions of visitors, schoolchildren, and new citizens would attribute to the silent figure in the harbor. Through this singular act of poetic alchemy, Lazarus achieved a synthesis of her life's passions. The classical scholar, the literary artist, and the fierce advocate for the oppressed converged to create a new American myth, universalizing the specific empathy she had cultivated for her own people into a foundational creed for the nation. This powerful vision of a compassionate, welcoming America, however, existed alongside her equally passionate call for a Jewish national homeland, creating a dynamic legacy that continues to challenge and inspire the twin pillars of this legacy, the universalist beacon in New York Harbor and the particularist dream of a restored Zion present, a fascinating intellectual puzzle. Emma Lazarus' tragically early death at the age of 38 from Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1938 left behind a body of work that seemed, to later generations, to be cleaved. On one side stood the Gilded Age classicist, the friend of Emerson, the poet whose sonnet transformed the Republican monument into a global symbol of welcome. On the other stood the fierce polemicist, the proto-Zionist author of an epistle to the Hebrews, who called for a robust, self-sufficient Jewish nationalism as the only viable answer to millennia of persecution. The subsequent century of scholarship and public memory often treated these as separate, even conflicting personally. The prevailing narrative elevated the poet of the immigrants while quietly shelving the advocate for a Jewish state, creating a more comfortable, sanitized version of her intellectual contribution. A deeper examination, however, reveals a powerful synthesis. Her life's work demonstrates a coherent evolution, where a profound commitment to her own heritage became the very engine for a more expansive and potent vision of human compassion. The perceived opposition between the new Colossus and an epistle to the Hebrews dissolves under scrutiny. They are better understood as two movements in a single, continuous composition. The epistle, published in a series of essays between 1882 and 1883, functions as a rigorous diagnosis of a specific historical ailment, drawing on the political philosophy of George Eliot and the historical consciousness of Heinrich Kreitz. Lazarus analyzed the precarious condition of European Jewry with unflinching clarity. She identified the root cause of suffering as homelessness, a lack of political agency, and the corrosive effects of a diasporic existence that depended always on the fragile tolerance of a host nation. Her proposed solution was concrete and political: the establishment of a national homeland in Palestine. This was a project of particularist self-determination, an argument for the dignity and security that can only arise from a people governing itself on its own soil. It was an intellectual framework built from the specific anguish she witnessed among the Russian refugees huddled on Ward's Island. The new Colossus, written in this same period, represents the ethical extrapolation of that same insight. Having diagnosed the malady of homelessness for her own people, she then turned her gaze to the universal human condition of the displaced, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, or the globalized expression of the specific refugees who first awakened her political conscience. The poem's power derives from its source in this tangible empathy. The welcome it extends is an active, compassionate one, providing a home for the homeless, tempest-tossed. It recasts America's purpose, transforming it from a republic of abstract ideals into a sanctuary grounded in the practical act of sheltering the vulnerable. In this light, the two works are perfectly complementary. The epistle argues for the right of a people to create their own home. The new Colossus articulates the moral responsibility of an established nation to offer a home to those who have none. Her universalism, therefore, is an earned one, forged in the crucible of a specific, deeply felt communal loyalty. It possesses a moral authority that a purely abstract humanism might lack. After her death, the process of her public canonization began, and with it, a selective remembrance. The America of the early 20th century, grappling with waves of immigration and its own evolving identity, found in the new Colossus a perfect articulation of its aspirational self-image. The poem was accessible, emotionally resonant, and politically useful. Her fierce, demanding proto-Zionist essays were another matter. They were complex, politically charged, and spoke to a specific concern that remained outside the mainstream of American public discourse. Consequently, her legacy was curated. The image of the mother of exiles came to dominate, effectively eclipsing the prophet of Jewish nationalism. This historical filtering was a gradual process, culminating in a popular understanding of Lazarus as a poet of the Statue of Liberty. Full stop. It required the dedicated work of later scholars, most notably Ralph Young in the late 20th century, to reintroduce the full scope of Lazarus's political and intellectual life. Their efforts recover the Epistle and other writings from relative obscurity, insisting that her vision for a Jewish homeland was central, and indeed foundational, to the worldview that produced her most famous sonnet. This restored, integrated understanding of her legacy reveals her profound influence on the central intellectual currents that followed. She stands as a foundational figure for generations of Jewish American writers and thinkers who would grapple with the same dynamic tension between particular identity and universalist aspiration. The novelist Cynthia Ozick, in her own incisive essays, has explored this very dilemma, questioning whether a writer's duty is to the specific parochial concerns of their heritage or to a broader, more cosmopolitan universal audience. Lazarus provides an early, powerful answer. The two are inseparable, and the latter gains its strength from the former. The complex negotiations of identity found in the works of authors like Philip Roth and Saul Bellow resonate with the path she first charted, navigating the space between the old world sh devil and the promise of the American street. Her vision for the Statue of Liberty, meanwhile, continues to be a living force in American civic life. The words she placed in the mouth of that silent monument were invoked in Supreme Court dissents on immigration law, cited in presidential speeches, and taught to school children as a core tenet of the nation's creed. She performed an act of immense cultural power, permanently altering the meaning of a national symbol. She gave it a voice, and that voice articulated a mission. Ultimately, Emma Lazarus's most enduring achievement was an act of prophetic reimagination. She looked at a colossal statue of copper and steel, a gift celebrating a historical alliance and an abstract concept of liberty, and she infused it with a soul. She endowed it with a new and profoundly challenging purpose. By scripting the words, "Give me you tired, you poor," she dared America to become an ideal it had yet to fully articulate for itself. She laid down a moral gauntlet, transforming a monument into a perpetual promise. That promise, and the challenge it represents, has lost none of its startling urgency. The voice she conjured in the harbor continues to speak across the decades, posing its fundamental question of welcome and compassion to every successive generation.
We really appreciate you tuning into this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.